It is July 1943. A small team of scientists works deep within the concrete bunkers of Porton Down, the British Army's top-secret chemical and biological warfare establishment in Wiltshire. The war in Europe shows no sign of ending. Germany's defenses grow stronger each month. The Allied invasion remains years away, if it comes at all. Yet today, in these underground laboratories, something extraordinary is being tested. A linseed cake, harmless-looking enough, is being saturated with the spores of anthrax bacterium. The cake is meant for cattle. Millions of cattle. German cattle. The scientists handling this material wear protective equipment that seems almost comical, muslin masks and rubber gloves that offer only the illusion of safety. One microscopic spore, inhaled or absorbed through a cut, could prove fatal. These men know what they are handling could change the course of the war. They are building weapons that would never be dropped, creating a strategy so radical that it would remain classified for more than 50 years. Operation Vegetarian was perhaps the strangest and most ambitious biological warfare scheme ever seriously contemplated during the Second World War. It was authorized at the highest levels of the British government. It was overseen by scientists of world-class standing. Millions of pounds were spent developing it. Production facilities were built. Test sites were prepared across Scotland and South Wales. And yet it remains one of history's most remarkable examples of military preparation for an operation that the people who planned it would never quite be able to bring themselves to launch. To understand why the British government would contemplate such a scheme, one must first understand the desperate strategic position Britain found itself in as 1943 began. The war in Europe had reached a peculiar stalemate. British and American forces had invaded North Africa, but the road to Berlin remained impossibly distant. Soviet forces were locked in a titanic struggle on the Eastern Front, winning battles but at catastrophic human cost. Germany, despite its failures at Stalingrad and North Africa, remained economically productive and militarily powerful. German agriculture, particularly the raising of livestock, was essential to feeding the Wehrmacht. German cattle provided not only food but also leather for uniforms and equipment. If that livestock supply could be decimated, the effects would ripple outward across the entire German economy. It was this thought that led to the genesis of Operation Vegetarian. Yet the problem was formidable. How do you poison millions of cattle scattered across a continent controlled by an enemy with considerable air defenses? How do you ensure the infection spreads, replicates, persists? Conventional bombing had failed to break German morale or production. How could a biological agent succeed where high explosives had faltered? The British intelligence services estimated that Germany possessed approximately 8.7 million cattle. These animals were concentrated in certain regions, particularly in the northern plains where the climate favored dairy farming. German agricultural organization, for all its efficiency, was not impenetrable. The Reich maintained organized feed distribution networks. Linseed cake, the pressed residue of linseed oil production, was a common supplementary feed given to cattle throughout the winter months and during periods of poor forage. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Manufacture linseed cakes saturated with anthrax spores, distribute them somehow over German territory, and allow nature to do the rest. Infected cattle would sicken and die. Herds would be called in panic. Economic disruption would follow. And because the infection would be biological rather than chemical, it might be attributed to natural disease outbreaks rather than deliberate attack, a form of plausible deniability that appealed to certain elements within the War Office. The problem, of course, was that making such a weapon reliable was extraordinarily difficult. Anthrax, whilst hardy, is not infinitely robust. The spores need to survive manufacture, storage, transportation, and distribution. They need to retain virulence through weeks of exposure to varying temperatures and humidity. They need to be in sufficient concentration that a single cake could infect an animal, yet not so concentrated that the cakes become immediately recognizable as dangerous. Moreover, the entire operation would be utterly dependent upon the cakes reaching German farms, an unprecedented logistical challenge given British air superiority and German fighter strength. And then there was the moral question, scarcely articulated in official documents but present nonetheless. Using biological agents against an entire population's food supply crossed lines that even wartime governments found difficult to justify, particularly when the likelihood of containing such an outbreak remained questionable at best. It fell to the scientists at Porton Down to solve these problems. Paul Fields, the laboratory's deputy director, became the chief scientist overseeing the project. Fields was a bacteriologist of considerable repute, a Fellow of the Royal Society, and a man of proven dedication to the war effort. Working beneath him was a small team of specialists in bacterial cultivation, fermentation, and weaponization. The task they faced was genuinely novel. Anthrax grows readily in laboratory conditions, but growing it in quantities of thousands of tons, the amount needed to saturate millions of cakes, presented problems of an entirely different magnitude. The British established a production facility near Newcastle upon Tyne, where the damp northern climate was thought to be less hostile to the spore production process. The scientists had to solve multiple technical challenges simultaneously. Firstly, they needed a method for cultivating anthrax in industrial quantities. The bacterium, once grown, would need to be processed into a stable powder that could be mixed thoroughly into linseed cake without degrading. The spores themselves needed to resist heat and humidity whilst remaining infective when consumed or inhaled by cattle. The researchers experimented with various production methods, but the most successful approach involved growing the bacteria in large fermentation vessels, then rendering the resulting broth into spore powder through a process of concentration and drying. The anthrax was mixed into the linseed cake at approximately 10 to 100 billion spores per cake, sufficient to infect cattle whilst remaining invisible to casual inspection. Testing was conducted at a remote range near Grunard Island off the Scottish coast. Cattle were pastured on the island, then exposed to the anthrax-laced cakes. The results were grimly conclusive. Within days of consumption, the animals began to sicken. Within a week, the infection spread throughout the herds with devastating effectiveness. The disease progression resembled natural anthrax infection, precisely because it was natural anthrax infection. The animals developed the characteristic lesions, respiratory distress, and finally succumbed to septicemia. The spores persisted in the soil and on the island's pasture grass for months, creating a test site so contaminated that it would remain officially quarantined until 1986. The biological effectiveness of the weapon was never in question. The spores worked exactly as the scientists predicted. Between 1942 and 1943, the British military ordered the production of approximately 500,000 linseed cakes infected with anthrax spores. These were manufactured in secret facilities and stored in specially prepared warehouses. The plan, if implemented, would have involved dispersing these cakes over German agricultural regions via aircraft, dropping them in scattered patterns across farmland. The timing would need to be precise. Late autumn, when German farmers were increasing feed supplements for the coming winter months, when cattle were most likely to consume unfamiliar supplements. British aeronautical engineers designed a specialized bomb case that would rupture at a predetermined altitude, scattering the infected cakes across a wide dispersal pattern. The strategic case for the operation seemed compelling to those who championed it. A successful campaign could reduce German cattle stocks by 30 to 40% within a single season. The economic consequences would be severe. Germany's food rationing system, already strained by decades of autarky, would fracture further. The disease outbreak, if concealed as a natural phenomenon, might avoid provoking retaliation in kind. And it offered Britain an offensive capability that neither conventional bombing nor ground invasion could currently provide. If you are finding this fascinating, a quick subscribe to the channel helps more than you know, and it means you won't miss the rest of this extraordinary story. Yet there existed alternatives, and the Americans pursued a radically different approach. The United States, despite its greater resources, had not developed biological weapons to the degree Britain had. Instead, American strategic doctrine emphasized massive conventional bombing campaigns aimed directly at German industrial infrastructure. The Americans were building the technological capacity to rain tens of thousands of tons of explosives on German cities in a single night. This approach would prove more costly in civilian lives, but offered something that biological weapons could not: visible, undeniable progress. You could photograph a destroyed factory. You could count the rubble. The Germans could see that they were being defeated. Biological weapons offered none of this psychological advantage. The enemy might not even know they had been attacked. Germany itself had investigated biological warfare, but rather half-heartedly. The Third Reich harbored a peculiar ideological inconsistency regarding scientific research. On one hand, the Nazis championed applied science and technological development. On the other, Nazi racial ideology created barriers to recruiting and employing the scientists necessary for cutting-edge biological research. German scientists in microbiology and bacteriology, many of whom were Jewish or politically unreliable, had been expelled or eliminated. The German army, furthermore, had adopted a doctrinal position that biological weapons were ineffective and ultimately uncontrollable. This was not a position born of moral squeamishness. German military conduct throughout the war demonstrated a profound moral emptiness, but rather of technical pessimism. The Wehrmacht's leadership believed that biological weapons would prove impossible to control and might even rebound against German forces. In this assessment, they were probably correct. Japan pursued biological warfare more aggressively. The Kwantung Army's Unit 731 in Manchuria conducted extensive research into plague, anthrax, and other pathogens, testing these agents on prisoners and even attempting to disseminate plague-infected fleas over Chinese cities. These operations caused genuine suffering and death, yet they proved strategically inconsequential. The diseases, once released, proved impossible to direct or contain with any precision. The Japanese biological warfare program ultimately demonstrated the very principle that had made German commanders skeptical. Biological weapons are inherently unpredictable agents that cannot be wielded with military precision. The British, however, had committed themselves to producing Operation Vegetarian to operational readiness. The decision to actually deploy it, however, never came. As 1943 turned into 1944, the strategic situation in Europe began to change. The invasion of Normandy was being prepared. American forces were pouring into Britain. The prospect of a conventional invasion, however costly, began to seem achievable. Moreover, there was growing recognition that biological weapons, once deployed by one side, would inevitably be adopted by the other. Churchill's government became increasingly concerned that launching such an attack might provoke German biological retaliation against Britain or against the Soviet Union, whose leader Stalin would certainly demand retaliation on a monumental scale. The political and strategic calculus shifted. Operation Vegetarian remained in readiness, but the decision was quietly made that it would not be used unless Germany deployed biological weapons first. The actual impact of Operation Vegetarian, therefore, was minimal. The weapon was never used. Yet its historical significance remains considerable. The project demonstrated that biological weapons could be manufactured at industrial scale, stored reliably, and delivered to target areas. It proved that anthrax, given the proper preparation, could be weaponized effectively for dispersal over agriculture. It established the technological groundwork that nations would pursue for decades after the war. And it revealed a fundamental truth about biological weapons that military planners have grappled with ever since, that once such weapons are deployed, control passes from the user to nature itself. The spores do not respect borders. The infected herds cannot distinguish between enemies and allies. the disease outbreak cares not for the intentions of those who released it. After 1945, Operation Vegetarian records were locked away. The scientist Paul Fields, despite his undoubted genius and wartime service, found himself unable to discuss his work publicly for years. Portondown continues still as a biological research establishment, officially dedicated to defensive measures against biological threats. The linseed cakes were destroyed. Gruinard Island remained a quarantine zone, a living monument to something Britain's government had once seriously contemplated but ultimately declined to do. Today, more than 80 years after Operation Vegetarian reached its height, the decision not to deploy it seems almost obvious. Yet in 1943, surrounded by enemies, facing what seemed like an endless war, the decision to forego such a weapon, even as it lay ready, required moral courage from Britain's leadership. The cakes are long gone. The spores that contaminated Gruinard Island have finally diminished with time. The plans and diagrams remain locked in government archives, occasionally declassified for historical research. Yet Operation Vegetarian endures as a cautionary tale. It reminds us that even in our darkest hours, when victory seems impossible and desperation gnaws at our resolve, there are lines that ought not to be crossed. The British could have done it. The technology worked. The farms existed. The cakes were ready. But the government that authorized the project ultimately decided that there were some weapons, once unleashed, that devour not just the enemy but everything in their path. It is a decision that deserves to be remembered.